The life of a medieval king was often filled with grandiosity and public spectacle. But the reality of ruling a kingdom in a turbulent medieval world was far less glamorous. The crown was heavy, and the responsibilities of kingship were vast and complex. From the moment the king awoke, his mind would already be burdened with the weight of decisions that would impact not only his personal life, but the lives of his subjects. No day was ever fully predictable. Each day came with new political, military, and social challenges that required the king's constant attention as the first light of morning crept through the windows of his private quarters. The king would be roused by the bell tolling in the distance, signaling the start of another demanding day. It wasn't the blissful, luxurious waking that the public imagined for royalty. Kings often woke groggy and sleep-deprived, weighed down by their worries. The weight of their kingdom, whether it be managing a crumbling relationship with nobles or dealing with an external threat, was a burden no one else could fully understand. A king's daily routine, unlike the imagined indulgence in feasts and grand balls, revolved around politics, strategy, and decision-making. That left little room for leisure. His first moments upon awakening were spent in quiet reflection. A medieval king was expected to be both a secular and spiritual leader. The separation of church and state was not a concept that existed during this time, and kings had to maintain their piety as much as they had to assert their political authority. After leaving his bed, he would often kneel before an altar or take a brief moment for personal prayer. The kingdom's prosperity, the stability of his reign, and even the protection of his family were believed to be in the hands of divine forces. By starting the day with prayer, the king sought divine guidance to manage the weighty issues of the day. Following his spiritual time, the king would prepare for the more demanding hours ahead. The royal chambers would come to life as servants would assist him with dressing. The clothes a king wore, though magnificent and adorned with gold and jewels, were not merely for show. They were a constant reminder of his status, but they were also cumbersome and heavy. Unlike the fantasies of wealth, a king's robes were often oppressive, made from rich but uncomfortable fabrics, designed to project authority but not comfort. While his attire spoke of luxury, it also echoed the heavy responsibilities that came with the position of kingship. The burden of wearing the crown itself, often a literal weight of gold, was a symbolic and physical reminder of the throne's expectations. Once dressed and prepared, the king would move to the heart of the palace or castle for the day's council meetings. Early mornings were often dedicated to strategizing with trusted advisors, many of whom would be the individuals responsible for making recommendations on various matters such as foreign diplomacy, defense, taxation, and even religious affairs. The atmosphere in the council chamber was serious and tense. The king had to listen to a myriad of perspectives, all shaped by different interests. As his advisors presented reports, petitions, and suggestions, these discussions were not casual but often fraught with intense political maneuvering. There was rarely a consensus, and the king had to maintain a careful balance between the demands of his advisors, the nobles, and the needs of the kingdom. The king's relationship with his nobility was central to his power, yet fraught with potential pitfalls. Noble families were powerful, each with their own ambitions, desires, and regional influences. The king had to engage in a delicate dance of diplomacy to keep these nobles in check. Too much favor to one faction could alienate others, and an imbalance of power could lead to rebellion or civil unrest. Many kings had to deal with the constant threat of internal strife as nobles sought to gain more land, more influence, and more wealth. The king's role as the supreme authority was often tested by these competing factions, and even the smallest misstep in favoring one noble over another could provoke a revolt. After the morning's council session, the king's day was typically filled with even more duties. He had to manage the affairs of the kingdom, from assessing the state of the treasury to ensuring the security of the realm. The king would meet with his treasurers, military commanders, and tax collectors to review the kingdom's finances. Medieval kings had to maintain a delicate balance between collecting enough taxes to fund the royal court, military campaigns, and public infrastructure, while not burdening their subjects too heavily. Taxation was often a sensitive subject, and revolts or uprisings could easily occur if the people felt that they were being unfairly taxed. Meanwhile, military concerns were never far from the king's mind. Even in times of peace, there was always the possibility of rebellion or external threats. The king would spend time with his generals and military advisors, discussing troop movements, fortifications, and strategies. Warfare was often an unpredictable part of the medieval world. Neighboring kingdoms could change alliances overnight, and an aggressive enemy might strike without warning. The king had to keep his forces prepared for battle, and his ability to lead them was critical for the defense of the realm. Even if the king did not directly engage in combat, his decisions on the battlefield were crucial to the kingdom's survival. The afternoon was often spent engaging with subjects, nobles, merchants, clergy, and even peasants who came seeking justice, land, or favors from the crown. The royal court was an arena where the king could exercise both mercy and authority. It was also a place where his decisions had lasting consequences. A subject might present a case, begging the king to resolve a dispute over land or inheritance. A merchant might request permission to establish a trade route or seek royal protection for his goods. A nobleman might be seeking to gain a title, or even attempting to sway the king's favor to acquire land. The king had to remain impartial, but also strategic in his decisions. Every decision affected the kingdom's social and political structure, and there were rarely easy answers. As evening approached, the king's day would shift from administrative to social and ceremonial obligations. Banquets, feasts, and courtly gatherings were common. These occasions, while seemingly indulgent, had important political functions. The king had to host visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and local nobility. These feasts were not merely for celebration. They were opportunities for the king to reinforce alliances, keep his nobles in check, and assert his authority. The king's role as host was central to his political power. Every toast, every conversation at the table was an opportunity to solidify the relationships that kept the kingdom intact. However, these social occasions were not without their own challenges. Maintaining the facade of a prosperous and benevolent monarch required constant effort. The king had to balance his image as a gracious ruler with the reality of the kingdom's struggles. While the nobles and dignitaries enjoyed the feast, the king knew that the hardships of war, famine, and political instability were only just beneath the surface. His actions during these events had long-term implications, and his every word was measured carefully. A misstep in conversation could lead to political fallout, and a poorly timed joke could become a source of scandal late in the evening. After the last of the nobles had left, the king would retire to his private chambers. The days were long and filled with demands, and as night settled, the king could finally seek some semblance of rest. But even in these quiet moments, the burden of kingship loomed large. The king's sleep was often filled with troubled dreams of war, betrayal, or rebellion. Few could understand the toll that such a life took on the mind and body. The pressures of rule never truly left the king, and he would often lie awake in the darkness, contemplating the decisions of the day and preparing for the battles, both political and military, that awaited him at the end of it all. The king would close his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring another round of challenges, decisions, and compromises. The public saw only the king on his throne, the royal processions, and the lavish feasts. But behind the facade of wealth and power, a king's life was a constant struggle to balance personal ambition with the needs of the kingdom. The crown was not a symbol of luxury, but of unrelenting responsibility. While the weight of the crown was the most obvious burden of a medieval king, the pressures surrounding personal relationships, family obligations, and the royal court often weighed just as heavily on the monarch. Despite the grandeur and power associated with kingship, a medieval king's life was rarely defined by moments of peace and joy. Instead, it was often dominated by the demands of marriage, maintaining dynastic continuity, and navigating the complex web of courtiers, nobles, and foreign diplomacy. A medieval king's relationship with his queen was far from the romanticized union often depicted in stories. Royal marriages, particularly in the medieval period, were strategic alliances designed to secure the kingdom's future, reinforce political power, and maintain peace with neighboring states. Love and affection were often secondary to the dynastic and diplomatic advantages that such unions provided. Marriages were arranged by the king's advisors, with little regard for personal feelings or compatibility. The king's queen, though married to him, often had her own set of responsibilities. She was seen as a figurehead of royal fertility, and her duty to produce heirs to the throne was paramount. While her personal well-being was important, her primary role was to secure the succession and maintain the stability of the royal bloodline. If a queen failed to provide heirs, her position within the royal court could be jeopardized, and political pressure would mount. For many medieval kings, the future of their dynasty and, by extension, their rule was tied to their queen's ability to bear children. Despite the intense pressures surrounding family life, there were rare moments of genuine affection between the king and his queen. These moments were usually brief and fleeting, lost in the heavy stream of royal duties. At times, the king and queen would have moments to themselves, particularly during evening meals or private conversations. These moments allowed the royal couple to engage in the more personal aspects of their lives, away from the eyes of the court and the demands of their subjects. However, these instances of quiet intimacy were rare and often overshadowed by the politics of the court. The king's children, particularly his sons, played an equally crucial role in his daily life. For the king, securing a male heir was one of his most vital responsibilities. A son not only ensured the continuation of the royal line, but also served as a direct reflection of the king's strength and legitimacy. The presence of a son, especially one of royal blood, was often regarded as the king's most important achievement, and he would do everything in his power to ensure that his heirs were raised to inherit the crown and continue his legacy. The king's sons were not just his heirs, they were also his protégés, the future rulers who would eventually take on the responsibilities that he himself had borne. Raising a son to be a king was a delicate task. The king had to ensure that his son was trained in the ways of warfare, diplomacy, and governance. Even as children, royal sons were often taught by the kingdom's finest tutors, learning about the history of their people, the intricacies of the royal court, and the tactics of warfare. For the king, this was both a duty and a source of immense pride. It was also a source of great anxiety, as the king could never know for sure whether his son would be able to succeed him, both in terms of strength and capability. Meanwhile, the king's daughters, though no less important, occupied a slightly different position within the royal family. While the primary goal of a daughter was to marry off well, often to a foreign prince or noble, the king had to carefully consider alliances for his daughters. Marriages were once again used as tools for diplomacy, with the king's daughters being married into other royal families to solidify political ties. These unions were typically arranged when the princesses were young and their personal desires were of little consequence in the decision-making process. Though the king may have shown affection for his daughters, they, too, were pawns in the larger game of statecraft. The royal court itself was a place where power and influence were constantly in flux. The king was surrounded by courtiers noblemen, ladies-in-waiting, trusted advisors, and foreign ambassadors, all of whom sought to gain favor and influence with the monarch. While the court was a place of etiquette and sophistication, it was also a breeding ground for intrigue, backstabbing, and shifting alliances. The king, despite his position of ultimate authority, was often surrounded by rivals who vied for his favor and sought to advance their own interests at court. The king's role as the center of his court's political life meant that every action, every decision, and every gesture was scrutinized by those around him. The king had to maintain a delicate balance of power, ensuring that no faction gained too much influence while keeping rivalries at bay. To do so, he relied heavily on his most trusted advisors, individuals who could provide him with counsel and insight into the various political currents at court. But even with such advisors, the king's own judgment was always tested. Every decision, whether it involved a family member, a noble, or a foreign dignitary, carried immense consequences. For his reign, while the pressures of the royal court were taxing, they were nothing compared to the king's role in diplomacy. Foreign relations were often the most delicate part of a king's reign. A single misstep could lead to war, a broken alliance, or the downfall of the entire kingdom. Diplomacy, though essential, was often a tangled web of promises, treaties, and negotiations. The king had to carefully manage the relationships with neighboring monarchs, foreign merchants, and religious leaders. The art of diplomacy was complex. Each move had to be calculated, each alliance carefully forged to strengthen the kingdom and its position in the world. For the medieval king, the process of diplomacy was often carried out in person, while royal letters and messengers played a key role. Face-to-face meetings were often seen as more personal and more binding. A king might receive visiting ambassadors, kings or queens from neighboring realms, all of whom brought their own agendas and demands. The king had to carefully manage these interactions, using charm, wit, and political acumen to secure favorable outcomes for his kingdom. At times, diplomacy would spill over into military matters, particularly when peace was threatened by foreign invaders. The king's role as a military leader was critical, and many medieval kings were also commanders of their armies. Even in times of relative peace, kings had to remain vigilant. Regular inspections of fortresses and military garrisons were crucial, and the king would often spend part of his day reviewing defensive strategies, maintaining the royal guard, and ensuring that his military forces were well prepared in case of conflict. By the time evening fell, the king's schedule would be filled with the final tasks of the day. He would often host another formal event, such as a banquet or a feast, for important foreign dignitaries or his closest advisors. During these events, the king was required to maintain an air of benevolence and grace. Though the feast was lavish, with music, entertainment, and food flowing freely, it was also an important time for the king to reaffirm his power and consolidate alliances. The court gathered to reaffirm their loyalty, and the king's presence at the feast was both a social and political statement. After the feast, the king would retreat to his private chambers, where he could reflect on the day's events. The solitude of the evening was often the only time the king could process the overwhelming demands of his position. The weight of his kingdom, the health of his family, and the stability of his court all rested on his shoulders. Even as he lay in bed, the king's mind would be restless, knowing that the challenges of tomorrow would arrive before he could even fully rest. Despite the public image of a life of luxury, the reality of a medieval king's day was one of constant pressure, responsibility, and vigilance. The glamour of the throne room was often a facade that masked the hidden struggles, both personal and political, that defined the life of a monarch. The king may have sat at the top of the social ladder, surrounded by wealth, power, and luxury, but the true nature of his life was one of perpetual anxiety and immense strain. The medieval king's life was rarely free from conflict. War, whether fought on the battlefield or waged through diplomacy, was a constant companion to the throne. A king's day was often dominated by the looming threat of external enemies, internal rebellion, or political scheming from rivals at home. Kings were not simply rulers of land, but also commanders of their armies, and the need to maintain a kingdom's defense was one of their most pressing responsibilities. In medieval Europe, the peace was often fleeting, and the king's mind was never truly at rest. Even in times of relative peace, a medieval king had to remain vigilant. The landscape of medieval politics was unpredictable. Alliances shifted like the wind, and enemies could arise from anywhere within the kingdom itself or from across distant borders. To be king was to walk a fine line between managing the kingdom's internal affairs and preparing for the external threats that could strike at any moment. The day began not with relaxation but with reports. A king would typically receive updates on the state of the kingdom's security and military strength. The sound of a messenger's boots on stone floors was a common and dreaded one. The royal messengers, often bearing news of military activity, could bring tidings of war, rebellion, or unrest. The king's first task each day was to assess the security of his kingdom, and these reports, delivered to him before the sun was even fully up, set the tone for the day. If there were rumors of rebellion in the northern territories or reports of a growing army at the kingdom's borders, the king would have to quickly decide how to respond. When external threats were imminent, the king would spend much of his time reviewing military reports. Generals, captains, and commanders from various provinces would provide him with updates on the readiness of their forces. If the kingdom was engaged in a prolonged conflict or was at war, the king would begin the day with military council. These military meetings often took place in war rooms or strategy chambers where maps and battle plans were laid out. Each map, each marked location, represented not just land, but live soldiers, civilians, and the very survival of the kingdom. A king's role as a military leader was as essential as his political and social duties. It was not enough for him to sit in his castle issuing decrees. He had to be prepared to lead his soldiers into battle, directing them on the front lines. This required constant preparation. Even on days when battle was not immediate, the king had to ensure that his military forces were equipped, well fed, and ready for engagement. In medieval times, A king's reign could rise or fall on the success of his military campaigns. Defeat could mean the loss of land, the weakening of his position, or the destruction of his dynasty. As the morning progressed, the king's council would often meet to discuss military tactics and assess whether a campaign was necessary. Such councils were tense and filled with debate. Each advisor had his own perspective, and many of the decisions had to be made quickly, without time for second-guessing. The king had to listen carefully to each advisor, but ultimately, the weight of the decision rested on his shoulders. Would he send his army to battle now, or wait for reinforcements? Should he negotiate for peace, or prepare for the worst? The king's military duties didn't stop at strategy alone. He had to ensure that the royal treasury was sufficiently stocked to fund the war effort. Armies required weapons, provisions, and shelter, all of which came at a steep cost. Collecting taxes, managing the kingdom's finances, and ensuring that there was enough gold to fund a war were all part of the king's daily obligations. While he was not directly involved in collecting taxes, he had to make sure that his financial officers did their job, maintaining a stable and profitable kingdom to fund the necessary wars. Despite the king's focus on military concerns, the constant worry of internal rebellion was never far from his mind. A medieval kingdom was a complex system of fiefdoms, territories, and alliances, and it didn't take much for a noble or local lord to start questioning the king's authority. Rebellions, particularly from disgruntled barons or powerful lords, were frequent in the medieval period. These internal threats were often more dangerous than foreign invasions, as they could erode the foundation of the monarchy itself. Rebellions were not always a direct military confrontation. Sometimes they could take the form of political intrigue, with nobles conspiring against the king from within his own court. One of the greatest fears for any medieval king was being betrayed by those closest to him. These kinds of threats were even more insidious because they often operated under the guise of loyalty. A noble who publicly pledged allegiance to the king might secretly be plotting to seize power, manipulating events to their advantage. Kings had to constantly watch their own backs, knowing that a trusted advisor or military leader might, at any moment, turn against them. Managing such threats was a full-time task. The king had to maintain a network of informants and spies, some of whom were likely courtiers, to keep tabs on any signs of insurrection. The king was rarely without a network of eyes and ears throughout his realm. These spies would bring reports to the king of suspicious movements, whispered conversations in taverns, or meetings that had taken place in the dead of night. As much as he ruled with power, the king was also ruled by the need to gather information to maintain control. In addition to dealing with military and political unrest, the king had to contend with the ever-present threat of disease and famine. Plague and sickness were common in the medieval period, and a king's ability to manage these crises could either strengthen or weaken his reign. Pestilence, often sweeping through rural villages and towns, could cause widespread panic and disruption. Kings had to make difficult decisions about how to manage such outbreaks, whether to quarantine affected regions or send in physicians to care for the sick. Similarly, famine could devastate an entire population, particularly when crops failed. Due to bad weather, the king had to coordinate food relief, organize trade with neighboring kingdoms for food supplies, and ensure that his people remained loyal despite the hardships. As the day wore on, the king would retreat to his royal study or chambers to review legal matters. A king was expected to uphold the law, and disputes between nobles, peasants, and merchants were brought to him for final judgment. He might sit at his desk, listening to counsel from legal advisors or judges, and then issue decrees or make rulings. In medieval times, the king's word was law, and his decisions carried the weight of absolute authority. Many kings enjoyed the process of meting out justice, seeing it as an essential part of their rule. However, dispensing justice was never as easy as it seemed. A decision to imprison a noble, or worse, to execute someone for a crime, could create enemies within the kingdom, potentially alienating those with influence. Throughout the day, the king would also have to maintain appearances. The public perception of a king's authority was essential to his rule. If the people or his court lost faith in him, his power could rapidly diminish. He would host formal banquets, attend feasts, and show benevolence toward the less fortunate in order to project an image of strength and generosity. These social functions, though important, were often taxing. The king had to smile, nod, and converse politely with courtiers, all the while knowing that the underlying reality was much darker, an undercurrent of political and military unrest that could explode at any moment. As evening approached, the king's day would wind down, but the work was far from over. He would often retire to his chambers, where his most trusted advisors would meet with him privately to discuss sensitive matters. These nighttime discussions were sometimes the most critical of the day, as they allowed the king to focus on key decisions without the pressure of public expectation. These final conversations would determine the course of the kingdom for the coming days, and the king had to listen carefully, weigh his options, and make sure that his decisions would not lead to disaster. As the day finally came to a close, the king would lie in his bed, exhausted from the mental and emotional toll of his duties. There was little time for relaxation or rest. The crown weighed heavy, and the king knew that when the sun rose the next day, he would be faced with even more decisions, each more critical than the last. His reign depended on his ability to make the right choices, and the pressure was constant. The life of a medieval king was not defined by luxury or glamour, but by constant vigilance, diplomacy, and the never-ending struggle to protect and preserve the realm. As the day wore on and the king's duties continued to pile up, the invisible burdens of kingship became harder to ignore. The life of a medieval king, though outwardly filled with power and influence, was often marked by profound isolation. Unlike the public appearances and celebrations that the subjects saw, the king's inner world was rarely as glamorous. In private moments, the king was acutely aware that every decision he made carried consequences that would ripple through the kingdom for generations. The burden of this responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the king could never escape the profound isolation of being the sole decision-maker, the final authority on matters of state and family. The medieval court, with its courtiers, noble families, and foreign diplomats, might have seemed like a bustling and vibrant place. Yet the king himself was often solitary, surrounded by people but feeling completely alone. The royal court was a world filled with competition, intrigue, and ambition. Nobles, advisors, and even family members sought to sway the king's decisions, hoping to advance their own agendas. But the king, sitting at the top of the hierarchy, was keenly aware that these individuals were often more focused on their own interests than on the well-being of the kingdom as a whole. He could trust no one completely, and his relationships, even with the closest advisors, were always colored by the complex dynamics of power. Despite the importance of maintaining alliances and ensuring that the court operated smoothly, the king was often trapped in a world of deception and hidden agendas. The need to maintain appearances and project strength and wisdom kept the king from showing any form of vulnerability. While others sought his favor, the king could never truly show his own weaknesses. He had to be resolute in his decisions, even when they were wrong, and always appear in control. This created a deep sense of isolation. The king could trust no one fully, and the weight of his power, while vast, was ultimately solitary. The burden of leadership did not just affect the king's emotional well-being, it also impacted his health. The constant strain of governance, combined with the pressures of military and political concerns, often led to stress and physical exhaustion. Kings rarely had time for proper rest or relaxation, and the demands on their time left little room for personal care. In an era when health was precarious at best, the king's physical well-being was always under threat. Many kings lived short lives, their bodies worn down by the constant strain of leadership, anxiety, and the exhausting nature of war and governance. The toll of maintaining power and managing the kingdom left little space for self-care. Even when the king was not physically fighting in battle, the psychological strain of war was constant. Each battle, each skirmish, carried not only the lives of soldiers, but the fate of the entire kingdom. Kings who lost battles faced humiliation, the potential destruction of their land, and, in some cases, even the end of their dynasties. The fear of losing one's kingdom, losing one's throne, or failing the people was a constant companion for any medieval king. This fear could cause nightmares, stress, and deepening anxiety. The king was haunted by the potential for failure and the consequences it would bring, not only for himself but for his heirs and for his people. But even beyond the anxiety of battle and political decisions, there was the legacy that the king had to constantly consider. The king's legacy was often shaped by his children. His sons, who would one day take the throne, carried his name and reputation. The king had to make sure that his heirs were prepared for leadership and that they would be able to continue his work, no matter how difficult or controversial his decisions were. Kings would often spend years training their sons, teaching them how to govern, how to fight, and how to rule with authority. But the king could never be sure that his sons would be able to live up to the task. The king's legacy was always in flux, dependent on how his sons would carry forward his rule. The weight of this uncertainty could be overwhelming. The king's decisions, especially regarding his heirs, were never easy. He had to carefully consider which of his children might be the best ruler and ensure that they were trained and prepared for the role. But there were always doubts. Was his son strong enough to lead? Was he capable of maintaining the kingdom's stability? Could he be trusted to protect the legacy that had been passed down to him? The king's anxiety over the future was not just limited to his own reign, but extended to the future of the entire kingdom. The king's relationship with his family could also be one of strain and complexity. While his queen played a critical role in the kingdom, their relationship was often bound by political necessity rather than affection. The queen's primary duty was to produce heirs, and her role in court was closely tied to her ability to fulfill this task. As a result, the king's relationship with his queen could sometimes be distant, dominated by the demands of ruling. However, despite this, there were moments of genuine connection. They would share quiet conversations in private, discussing not just politics, but their personal hopes and fears. In rare moments, the king and queen would retreat to the royal garden or chambers, where they could talk about their family, their kingdom, and their personal concerns. However, these moments of intimacy were fleeting, and the weight of their royal duties was never far behind. The royal children, while beloved by their parents, were also affected by the harshness of court life. Princes and princesses, though raised in luxury, were not immune to the stress of their future roles. The king would watch his children grow up, knowing that they would one day be responsible for leading the kingdom, but also fearing the toll that such responsibilities would take on them. The pressure of the crown was a heavy burden to carry, and the king would often question whether his children were truly ready for the task. The life of a prince was one of constant preparation, filled with education, military training, and political indoctrination. The prince was not simply a child. He was a future monarch, and every moment of his upbringing was spent preparing him for that future. As evening descended upon the castle, the king's day would slow down, but the strain never fully lifted. His royal chambers were often filled with advisors and nobles, discussing plans for the next day or seeking the king's guidance on urgent matters. The king was seldom truly alone. Even in the quiet of his chambers, he was still immersed in the weight of governance. His thoughts would often return to the future of the kingdom and the decisions he had made earlier in the day. Sleep, though necessary, was often elusive for the king. The weight of his responsibilities, the fear of losing the throne, and the pressures of ruling often kept him awake at night. His mind would race with thoughts of battles fought, alliances made or broken, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. The king was trapped in a cycle of endless responsibility, with no time for personal reflection or rest. The throne was never truly his to enjoy. It was a position filled with constant vigilance, endless decision-making, and an overwhelming desire to preserve his kingdom's future. And so, as the castle settled into darkness, the king would lie in his bed, aware that tomorrow would bring yet another day filled with complex decisions, political intrigue, and the ever-present weight of leadership. The glamour of the throne room, the splendor of the crown, and the celebration of royal life were all just a mask. Beneath it, the king's life was one of constant pressure, personal sacrifice, and an unrelenting desire to protect his people, his kingdom, and his legacy. As the day wound to a close and the king's responsibilities grew fewer, the night was the only time he could momentarily escape from the ceaseless demands of his kingdom. But even in solitude, the consequences of his rule followed him. The medieval king's life, though defined by an unrelenting torrent of decisions and actions, was ultimately shaped by what would be remembered of him. His legacy, the way history would record his reign, was just as much a part of his daily life as the affairs of state. The king, while making decisions for today, was also making choices that would affect generations to come. The kingdom's prosperity, the survival of his bloodline, and the stability of the kingdom were all ultimately bound to how future generations would view his reign. History, particularly in the medieval world, was shaped by the narrative handed down by chroniclers, religious figures, and even the king's own advisors. The king was aware that the story of his reign would be told long after his death, either as a triumphant leader who had built a strong kingdom, or as a tyrant whose legacy was mired in failure, conflict, or mismanagement. This awareness added yet another layer of pressure on the king, knowing that his actions and decisions were not only impacting the present, but would define his future, and the future of his heirs. The thought of being remembered as weak or ineffective was a constant fear for a monarch, and one that often influenced his decisions as evening turned to night. The king often found himself reflecting not just on the events of the day, but on his broader role in the kingdom's history. He would contemplate his place within the long line of kings that came before him, wondering whether he had lived up to the legacy of those who had ruled before him. For some kings, this reflection would be filled with pride, knowing they had accomplished great things. For others, it would be filled with regret, questioning whether they had made the right decisions or whether they had failed the people who depended on them. Despite the complexity of their lives, kings were rarely free from the judgment of their people. The medieval monarch, while powerful, was always vulnerable to public opinion. The people of the kingdom, whether peasants, merchants, or nobles, looked to the king for stability and leadership. But the king was often seen in a light that was far from realistic. While the public saw the king as a figure of immense power, they were also quick to criticize when his decisions brought hardship or suffering. In times of famine or war, the king could become a scapegoat, his rule challenged by those who felt his leadership was inadequate. The king's decisions on taxation, military campaigns, or the treatment of the common folk could make or break his reputation. This relationship with public perception was a double-edged sword. The king needed to project strength and fairness, but he was also aware that he was bound by the expectations of those around him. In times of peace, when there was little public unrest, the king could bask in the glory of his rule, surrounded by ceremonies, feasts, and lavish entertainments. But when disasters struck, whether in the form of a rebellion, a failed military campaign, or a financial crisis, the king was often the first to be blamed. His subjects, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, would turn their anger on him, and the throne could become a seat of instability. For the king, there were few things more terrifying than the loss of public support. A rebellion could arise swiftly, as discontented nobles or disillusioned commoners sought to overthrow a monarch they believed was failing them. In medieval times, rebellion was a common response to perceived injustice, and many kings lived in constant fear of a revolt. The potential for revolution always loomed large, and the king was never truly safe. In the face of such threats, the king would often resort to harsh measures to quell dissent, deploying the army to suppress uprisings, and punishing traitors with ruthless efficiency. While this secured temporary stability, it also contributed to the king's overall sense of insecurity, knowing that his hold on power was always fragile. The king's role in war was similarly linked to his public image. Military victories could cement a king's legacy, making him a hero in the eyes of the people. However, defeats could prove catastrophic. A lost battle could not only result in the death of soldiers, but also tarnish the king's reputation and challenge his ability to rule effectively. The king's military engagements, particularly those that involved the defense of his kingdom, were pivotal moments in his reign. Success brought acclaim, while failure led to criticism and, in some cases, the collapse of his power. As the king lay in bed each night, his thoughts were filled with considerations of how history would judge him. Would his reign be remembered for its peace and prosperity, or would it be remembered for its failures and internal conflicts? The notion of legacy was an ever-present concern for the medieval king, and the pressure to secure a lasting name for himself weighed on his mind. Many kings, aware that their descendants would inherit the throne, made decisions that were not just about the present, but about shaping the future. Would his children be strong enough to continue his work? Would they be prepared for the challenges of leadership that would come with their own reign? The king's relationship with his heirs, especially his sons, was deeply tied to his sense of legacy. The relationship between the king and his heirs was often a delicate one. While kings hoped for strong and capable sons who could follow in their footsteps, they also faced the possibility that their heirs might not live up to the standards of their fathers. This anxiety about succession often led to tense family dynamics. The king had to prepare his heirs for the responsibilities of ruling. But there was always the fear that his sons might not be capable of maintaining the kingdom's stability or might fall prey to the same flaws that had led to the downfall of other monarchs. Some kings tried to groom their heirs by involving them in the decision-making process, bringing them into councils or military campaigns. Others, however, kept their heirs at a distance, fearing that too much exposure to the inner workings of the court could lead to rivalries or rebellion within the family itself. Even as the king's reign continued, the passage of time brought new challenges. The world around him was changing, whether through evolving political structures, growing trade routes, or changing cultural dynamics. A medieval king had to be adaptable, constantly adjusting his strategies to ensure that his kingdom remained strong and his dynasty continued to thrive. This pressure to evolve and stay ahead of the curve was taxing, and many kings found themselves facing opposition not only from external enemies, but also from internal forces seeking to modernize or challenge the old ways of ruling. The balance between maintaining tradition and embracing innovation was a difficult one, and it was a question that occupied the minds of kings throughout the medieval period. And so, as the final moments of the day passed and the king prepared to sleep, he was left to reflect on his reign. The kingdom, while seemingly solid, was always at risk. History, with its sharp judgment and unforgiving gaze, loomed large in the background of his thoughts. Would he be remembered as a wise and just ruler, or would his name be cursed by the annals of time? The king's legacy was shaped not just by his victories, but by the consequences of his actions. The alliances he forged, the battles he fought, the rebellions he quelled, and the families he protected or betrayed. In the end, the king's reign was not just about ruling a kingdom. It was about the delicate and often painful process of shaping a legacy that would last long after his death. The crown was not just a symbol of power. It was a constant reminder of the responsibility to protect his people, preserve the kingdom, and ensure that the story of his reign would be one worth telling.